All right, I think I've mentioned this a couple times, but just as a reminder, we're a little bit behind in getting the videos up on the website. The good news is that I've taught this class at a little bit of a higher level. I used to teach it for two different seminaries, one in Kansas City and one in Germany, actually. But the last time that I taught it at a seminary level, we recorded all of those lectures, so it follows the same pattern. It's just going to be a little bit more deeper than what we're doing here. And those videos are out there on the Convincing Proof website. So if you miss a week, if you want to check out one of these topics in a little bit more detail, you can do that. If you go to convincingproof.org, on the top right corner, there's several options. One of them is classes, and one of the classes is just general apologetics. And that'll take you to a link, probably to YouTube, I believe, or maybe even within the website itself, which will list all the classes in order. But we are working on getting these classes up on the website as well, and that's going to be called a teen apologetics class, because this was designed for the youth group. Although I'm very thankful that a lot of you young at heart are joining us as well. So if you remember, I've shared a few times now that these are the steps that I take when it comes to apologetics. So when I'm making a case for Christianity, I'm trying to give reasons and evidence to believe that Christianity is true, I start at ground zero. I start with the existence of God. Is there a God? What are the reasons and evidence we believe that, in fact, there is a supreme being? Now, this is the tactic or method, strategy, approach, whatever you want to call it, that I take when I'm talking to a broad audience, or maybe when I'm writing this out as a book, because I'm speaking to a large audience, either here, maybe at a university, at a conference, and you just don't know who's in the audience. You don't know where they're at. You don't know if they believe in God or not. And so I start at the very beginning and go all the way through and make this case for Christianity. Obviously, though, if I'm talking to an individual, right, then I will mix things up. And I will usually start with where they're at. So, for example, if I have a conversation with a Muslim, I'm not going to say, hey, my approach is to start with the existence of God, so you've got to sit there and listen to all of my arguments that there is a God. Well, no, as a Muslim, he already believes that there is a God. He has some incorrect beliefs about what God is like, but he already believes that there is a God, so I will jump in that conversation right to step 2. Does that make sense? So in that regard, I'm not rigid in my approach. It is flexible depending on the person that you're talking to. I will say that in my approach when it comes to evangelism, so when I go out and share the gospel with people, I don't even start with apologetics. So when I'm talking about my approach and what I start with and where I go, I'm talking about my apologetic conversations. But when I go out and just do general evangelism, I start with the gospel. And this is the approach that I have found to be most useful, and I think it's probably, I'm hesitant to say the biblical approach. Everybody says their approach is the biblical approach. But I think it's wise, let me say it that way, I think it's wise to start with the gospel. So I'll just go through a very basic gospel conversation, no matter who I'm talking to, and just lay out. Usually I'll ask them permission to explain what I believe. So I'm entering a conversation. I'm assuming that we have differences in what we believe, and so I want to hear what they believe and how it might differ than what I believe. So in that conversation, in that type of conversation, I ask permission to share what I believe, and then I summarize my belief basically as the gospel. So I share the gospel, explain how someone can be reconciled back to the God who loves them and created them for a loving relationship with Him, but that relationship is broken because of our evil choices. And then encourage them, with the words of Christ that He promised anybody who would put their faith in what He did for them on the cross, instead of what they can do themselves to earn favor with God or earn their way into a right relationship with God, to trust what Jesus did for them on the cross is what Jesus promised is how we can be forgiven and reconciled back to the God who loves them. So I always start with the gospel, and then get a chance to hear what they believe, and that will usually open up the door for an apologetics conversation. If it's even necessary. Sometimes it's not even necessary. But if their belief system is radically different, or if they bring up objections to what I said in my gospel presentation, that's when I have all these other tools that I can go through. So don't think, I don't want anybody to think that when I go out and share the gospel, I'm going through, 4 months worth of material and rigidly having to go through this method. This is the method that I follow when I'm presenting to a group, or maybe writing it out as a book, making a case for Christianity from ground zero. Today is going to be an interesting day because we are shifting to the second step. We've covered a lot of reasons and evidence to believe that there is a God. We looked at the strongest argument against the existence of God, the problem of evil. So I think we're ready. We're at a good point now to transition to the second step. Interestingly, you could often jump to this step maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago, because if you go back enough decades, especially here in America, the vast majority of people did believe that there was a God. And so this first step wasn't as pertinent. I don't want to say it wasn't as important, but it wasn't maybe as pertinent because the vast majority of people believed that there was some sort of supreme being out there. But that is rapidly changing. And so this first step is becoming more and more pertinent in our apologetic approach. I want to share with you some statistics just to kind of shock and awe you, hopefully, so you can see how just belief that there is a God in general is dropping rapidly in our country. These are some statistics that were put together and released last summer in July 2023 from a Gallup poll. Take a look at this. They reported that belief in God among Americans has dropped from 90% in 2001 to 74% in 2023. So just think about that for a moment. There was only 1 in 10 who would say that there is no God, describe themselves as an atheist, agnostic. But now we're talking about 1 in 4 in 2023. Probably the scarier statistic is the next one, and it's among the younger ages. Look at that. We're approaching 50-50. And this is just belief in God. This has nothing to do with Christianity. This is just that there is some sort of higher power, some sort of ultimate being. And so this first step is becoming more and more pertinent, and that's why we spent 5 weeks. I think it's good to be familiar with the reasons that we believe that there is a God. And so we went through those arguments in a lot of depth. But I think, especially at the start of each lecture, I gave a simplified version of those arguments. And that's relatively easy to remember, some of those simplified arguments. And so when I'm in a conversation, I can run through some of those main arguments for God in just a few minutes. They're pretty basic. First cause arguments, design arguments. The moral argument might be a little bit more technical, but it's good to be familiar with those. By the way, these were the arguments then, families of arguments that we looked at. And we made some conclusions. This is usually how it works when we put together these arguments for the existence of God. We use something called abductive reasoning to make some conclusions. Because as you remember, even with a first cause argument, it didn't end with the existence of God. It ended with just there being a cause, a first cause of the universe in that case, that particular one we looked at. But first cause arguments usually end up with the conclusion that there is a first cause. But we can use abductive reasoning to make some reasonable conclusions about what this first cause must be like. And so we put together a list of attributes, and these are conclusions that really thinkers from around the world and throughout history have come to independently, that there is a supreme being that generally has these sort of characteristics. And I'll just, as a reminder, go through and refresh our our minds on how we came to these conclusions. So from first cause arguments, since the universe had a beginning, there must be a cause beyond the universe, right? And if the universe just is nature, that's what we call the universe, nature. If you're a naturalist, you believe that all that there is the physical material universe. So if this first cause is the cause of the universe, it would make sense, and even the astronomers that we looked at said this, that this first cause, it seems reasonable to conclude that it is beyond nature. It is super nature, supernatural. Since the universe just is space, time, and matter, that's what the universe is made up of, space, time, and matter, whatever caused the universe must be beyond that, or before. The first cause came before space, before time, before matter existed. So it's reasonable to conclude this first cause is spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. If it brought the universe into existence from nothingness, not a vacuum, not space, nothing, then I think it's reasonable to conclude this first cause is extremely powerful and, by definition, a creator. From design arguments, we can see that the universe shows has some very telling characteristics that it has been designed, very fine-tuned constants of the universe. And we've just never seen design come from any other source than an intelligent mind. Maybe it's possible for design to come some other way, but we've just never seen it. And so it seems reasonable to conclude, since our universe shows signs of design, that this first cause is some sort of an intelligent mind. And then lastly, from moral arguments, because we discover here in this reality we exist in, love and morality, such an important part of reality, I think it's reasonable to conclude that this first cause, this supreme being, if you want to use that term, is the source of love and morality. If it's the ultimate source of morality, it seems reasonable that this first cause is morally perfect. And because morality has to do with persons, right? Non-persons don't seem to interact in the moral realm. Morality specifically seems to have to do with persons being good or bad to other people. You being a person, a non-person, doesn't really seem to be able to do anything good or bad, right or wrong. So morality is definitely has to do with persons. It's a personal experience, a personal thing that we encounter. It seems reasonable to conclude that the source of morality, this first cause, is also personal. So as I've said, separate thinkers, different cultures throughout history and around the world have come to a similar conclusion that there is a supreme being that has these sort of characteristics. And this isn't a coincidence. It's not a coincidence because all of these different thinkers independently arrived at this conclusion through a similar thought process. As they looked around at the world and their experience, their moral experience, and looked around at the universe, studied things, they came to this conclusion by thinking rationally, reasonably, logically through these issues. And so that's why you find these arguments all around the world and throughout history. First cause arguments, design arguments, and moral arguments. Because it's the similar thought process as to how these folks came to this conclusion. Now, a great book which summarizes a lot of this is Does God Exist? This is a book which will document for you what I just keep saying, that you can find these arguments all around the world throughout history. This book actually documents it. And so you can see different cultures, different thinkers from different places throughout history coming to these same conclusions through these type of arguments as they come up with them independently. Let's look at some examples as we're doing kind of a transitionary lecture today. I want to point out some of these examples of arguments for God throughout history and around the world. We've got several examples in the early Greek philosophers. I'll just go through some of the most famous ones. So you've got Socrates. He argued that the world seemed providentially designed by a vastly knowledgeable and powerful being. And to make his case, he would use very simple things. He would point to even our eyelashes and our eyebrows seem to have been designed for the purpose of shielding our eyes. And as I mentioned before, this is the case of even polytheistic belief systems. So even within a belief system that believed in many gods, they would usually have one ultimate God that created all the others. So we could even put them in this category of believing in a supreme ultimate being. All right, Plato has several arguments for the existence of God. A very interesting one, and he's known for his Platonic forms. But in his thought process, he viewed the world around him and noticed that everything here is in flux, right? Everything is constantly changing. Our bodies are changing, the rivers are changing, the weather is changing. This realm, this physical realm, doesn't seem to be a firm enough foundation for absolute truth, because everything here is changing. And so he posited that there must be another realm where absolute objective truth comes from, and had a very elaborate story, a very elaborate explanation about how that transcendent truth from that transcendent realm can get down into us, can get down here into this physical realm that's always in flux, that's always changing. But the early church fathers, like St. Augustine, he was very impressed with Plato. And St. Augustine, for example, said that Plato, even though he didn't realize it, when he talked about this transcendent realm, was actually describing the mind and nature of God. And so just from general revelation, Plato was able to come up with some remarkable, correct conclusions about this transcendent realm that ultimate truth, objective, absolute truth must come from. Plato also argued for a divine being from the order of the motion of the stars and of all the things under the dominion of the mind which ordered the universe. So again, you see here a conclusion that this supreme being must be some sort of an intelligent mind, a best soul who's the maker and father of all, the king who ordered the primordial chaos into the rational cosmos that we observe today. Of course, Aristotle as well. He has that famous unmoved mover argument. Now, these folks didn't use the term God, obviously. We'll get into that later, where that term God came from. But in their Greek language, they would use the word theos, where we get the term theology from, Theos. But it's important not just to get hung up on the different names that people would use for the idea of a supreme being. It's important instead to focus on how they described this supreme being they believed in. So in Aristotle's case, he described this supreme being, theos in his language, as living, intelligent, incorporeal, eternal, and a most good being, the source of order in the cosmos. So and I'm just giving you the highlights of ancient Greek philosophers, the most famous ones. There were many, many Greek thinkers who concluded that there must be a supreme being. We have a very interesting situation in Acts 17, where Paul is actually interacting with some of these Greek philosophers. So in this conversation, we see Paul talking with Greek philosophers who believe in a supreme being. And he starts his conversation. It's very, very interesting. We're going to look more in Acts 17 later, more towards the end of this lecture. But just to put a bug in your ear right now, in this conversation that Paul has with these Greek philosophers, he points out to them that they are correct in believing that there is a supreme being. In fact, Paul quotes two of their own Greek authors to make the point that, yeah, you guys are correct. There is a supreme being out there. Going back to some of these ideas from Greek philosophers, how they came to this conclusion through general revelation that there must be a supreme being, Paul agrees with them. He says, you guys are right. In fact, your own Greek poets have said these things about God, and you guys are correct. There is a supreme being. Interestingly enough, then, Paul goes on to explain that some of their beliefs about this supreme being are incorrect, and he lovingly, gently, I would say respectfully, points out where they're wrong in their thinking about this supreme being, but he does agree with them that they're correct in thinking that there is an ultimate supreme being out there, and uses some of their own authors to make the point that they were correct in thinking that. So let's run through some other famous cultures, some other famous belief systems throughout history, just to show you guys what I've been saying, but I want to give you the evidence for it now, that these arguments and beliefs about a supreme being can be found throughout history and all around the world. You can look at the ancient Persian culture. The ancient Persians had a belief system that's usually referred to as Zoroastrianism. It was the major religion of the Empire of Persia from the 6th century BC until the 7th century AD. There are still some Zoroastrians out there, but in terms of world religions, it's a very small minority these days. Most of them live in India. But Zoroastrianism, interestingly, it was founded by a person named Zarathustra. Maybe you've heard that name before. Sometimes he's called Zoroaster. That's why the religion's called Zoroastrianism. But Zarathustra promoted monotheism, focused on morality and justice. And I find this religion very fascinating. In fact, the very first work of mine that was published was an article I wrote for an encyclopedia on Zoroastrianism. It's a very fascinating religion, and I want to just describe some of their core beliefs to you, because it's remarkable how much it lines up with Judaism and even what we would say Christianity. Its basic teachings are very similar to Judaism. So, for example, Zoroastrians believed that there was a supreme being that created in 7 stages, resulting in an initial perfect paradise, but corruption was introduced by a powerful evil being. They believed in a coming Savior who would be better than a good man, would be born of a virgin, and lead a victorious final battle against evil and restore the physical world. They believed that human souls are eternal, that there will be an individual final judgment, that there's a heaven and a hell. They would use different terms for those, obviously. And then human bodies will be resurrected. Now, what's really fascinating to me, and I think you'll appreciate this, and you might have heard this before, but the priests in this religion were referred to by a certain name. Anybody want to guess what that name might have been? Magi. So Magi were the priests of this religion. So it just makes you wonder, right? We're familiar with Magi and the gospel story, coming to see the Jesus when he was born. It just makes you wonder, and there's just a lot of speculation about how those Magi and the Zoroastrians knew some of these things. And it's been posited that there might be some connections there with Daniel. So you remember Daniel from the Old Testament. He was, during the exile, he was taken out of Israel and lived, Nebuchadnezzar, you know that whole story. Then Daniel lived in Babylon. But it might be the case that through Daniel, some of these Persian thinkers were told some of these things that they had correct. And that might even be how the Magi knew then to come and visit the Savior that was born, Jesus, as we see in the gospel stories. So just some interesting connections there. You can do some more research about Zoroastrianism if you'd like. Not only in Western cultures, also in Eastern cultures, we find arguments for the existence of God. I'm not even going to try to pronounce some of these words, so just bear with me. But I want to give you these examples. So in Eastern cultures, in India, for example, philosophers in this tradition argue that since the universe has parts that came into existence at one occasion and not another, it must have a cause. The universe must have a cause. In a commentary to the Brahma Sutras, Adi Sankara, argues that the original karmic actions themselves cannot bring about the proper results at some future time. Neither can supersensuous, non-intelligent qualities by themselves mediate the appropriate, justly deserved pleasure and pain, the consequences for our actions. The fruits, according to him, must be administered through the action of a conscious agent, namely a supreme being. And in this book, I love the name of this book, A Handful of Flowers of Logic. Leave it to Eastern folks to come up with beautiful names here. A Handful of Flowers of Logic. In this book, this is a statue of this gentleman, Yana, possibly. He gave 8 arguments for a supreme being, 4 of which are different types of first cause arguments. We're going really rapidly through these. The book that I recommended at the beginning, you can check out, goes into more detail. But within the Indian culture, more recently, Gandhi, who you're probably familiar with, he published several articles making a case for the existence of God, using first cause arguments, design arguments, and moral arguments. So here we have in more of a Hindu, Eastern Indian culture, making these same type of arguments. So for example, he wrote, Gandhi, in the early 1900s, there's an orderliness in the universe, an unalterable law governing everything and every being that exists or lives. It's not a blind law, for no blind law can govern the conduct of living beings. That law, then, which governs all life is God. Law and lawgiver are one. Obviously, in the Jewish culture, we've got a lot of folks making arguments for the existence of God. This might be one of the most well-known Jewish philosophers, Jewish thinkers, Maimonides, possibly. He achieved fame as a physician, made a lot of scientific discoveries in the area of medicine, cures and such, but he also offered several arguments for the existence of God. In the Arabic culture, we've got several thinkers, philosophers throughout history making similar arguments for the existence of God. The last one there argued for God by starting with the premise, this might sound familiar to you, everything that begins to exist requires a cause of its beginning. So similar to our first cause argument that we looked at. And then certainly within the European culture, there's been all sorts of thinkers that have made a case for the existence of God. And really every stage of Western culture has had major proponents of theism that argued for theism, putting together similar arguments or developing new arguments within those common families that we've looked at, first cause, design, and moral arguments. So if we go back to the medieval era, you've got folks like St. Augustine, Anselm, Thomas Aquinas. In the modern era, you've got folks like Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz. In the Enlightenment, you got Voltaire, Isaac Newton, very well known as the Einstein of his day. He put together several interesting new arguments for the existence of God. I'll give you one, just for example. He argued in his book, Optics, that we must infer from the order and beauty in the world to the existence of an intelligent supreme being as the cause. In the postmodern era, we've got folks like Immanuel Kant and Soren Kierkegaard. And then in the contemporary, the last 50 years, we could talk about folks like Alvin Plantinga. We've discussed him a bit. He's very well known within philosophy. And I think Alvin Plantinga is one of those people that we're going to be reading, or people will be reading 200, 300 years from now. There's not many people whose works last that long. But just like we still refer back to Aristotle, or we still refer back to Thomas Aquinas, or Immanuel Kant, I think Plantinga is going to be one of those thinkers that future generations will refer back to. And then Richard Swinburne as well. Swinburne is a remarkable philosopher at Oxford University. And my academic lineage is as follows. So I got my PhD under Dr. Greg Welty, and Dr. Welty got his PhD under Richard Swinburne at Oxford. So that's a little bit of my academic lineage. It's usually, when it comes to a PhD, it's usually more important who you study under than the location or the school in which you study at. Okay, so the promised discussion question for you this morning, we've covered a lot of arguments for the existence of God, and so I want you to discuss, just for a few minutes with folks that are sitting around you, talk about your own confidence, maybe in the past or your confidence now. You can talk about how you came to believe that there is a God, that any of these arguments play a role in that. How confident are you now in your life that there is a God? And then maybe after you've had that conversation, you can talk about these different arguments. Which one do you find most compelling? Which one do you see as maybe a weaker argument for the existence of God? Play the devil's advocate, maybe push back against one of the arguments. That's a healthy endeavor, because as we have these conversations with each other, we can point things out and help each other understand things better, and maybe even come up with a way to make these arguments stronger. So don't feel bad or be afraid to play the devil's advocate. You're not arguing that there is no God. You're just arguing that that might not be the best argument for the existence of God. There's certainly bad arguments for things that are, in fact, true. So go ahead and discuss for just a few minutes. I'll let you guys get together and chat with your neighbors for a bit. Okay, hopefully you had some good conversations there real quick. Yeah, in terms for me believing in God, I'm very confident that there is a God. I would say, though, in my case, I grew up in a rural Nebraska culture where everybody believed that there was a God. Not that anybody ever talked about him, but most people believed that there was a God. So I just grew up believing that there was a God and didn't think much of it until my teenage years. And it was in my teenage years and definitely in my 20s, I had a lot of doubts as to whether what I had been taught was really true, whether there was really a God or not. And it was that time in my life that I really fell in love with apologetics and discovered these arguments for the existence of God. And so I would say I continued believing in God because of these arguments, if that makes sense. And I would say that my doubts about the existence of God were large questions and doubts that I had. So I would say without these arguments, my belief in God might have lessened or even disappeared completely. So I wouldn't say that I began believing in God because of these arguments, but my belief in God has continued, I think, because of these arguments. Now, I want to pause here before we move on to the second step and talk about the word God, because I've found that it causes a bit of confusion. And depending on your background, depending on where you're from, depending on your prior beliefs, the term God can carry with it a lot of connotations, a lot of baggage. So I've been using the term God in a very general way. I haven't been necessarily talking about the biblical God. I've just been using the term God in a very general way to talk about the idea of there being an ultimate, supreme being. That's what I've been using the term. That's how it's used in the English language. It can be used to talk about a specific description of God, like the biblical God or the Christian description of God. But it can also be used just in general to talk about the idea of there being a supreme being. So when somebody says they believe in God, don't think that their understanding of God is just like yours, a Christian description of God. They might be referring to a different description of God, or just the idea of a higher power, a supreme being. So let's talk about this word a little bit. I find this to be helpful for folks in understanding this term, where it came from, and why we use it. As we've already seen, going through different thinkers around the world and throughout history, different terms have been used to describe that idea of there being a supreme being. So you can list out all of these different terms that different cultures have used. You might be familiar with the term El, E-L. That was a very common term in the ancient world. Some people call it Proto-Semitic. But the Phoenicians, Aramaic, Hebrew, Canaanites, Akkadians, Hittites, all those languages used this term El to refer to the idea of a supreme being. And this is even found in a lot of our names. Anybody here in the room that has a name with EL at the end is referring back to this term, which was used for a supreme being, what we use the term God for. So Michael, Daniel, Michelle, Samuel, all those L's at the end of those names is referring back to this ancient term for a supreme being that all these different people groups used. In Latin, of course, it's the term Deus. I think it's pronounced Deus. And that was developed into Romance languages, French, Italian, Spanish. That's the term they use. In India, there's several different terms for a supreme being, depending on what region in India you're at. Zoroastrianism, Slavic, Russian languages, ancient Egypt, Chinese, Persian, talked about Greek. The Arabic word is Allah for the idea of a supreme being. Sometimes an Arabic person will use that term to talk specifically about the Muslim description of God, but just like our English term God, it can be used to just refer in general to the idea of a supreme being. Interestingly enough, I like to point out sometimes to people that the word God is not found in the Bible. So God is not necessarily, what did I say this? Is not necessarily tied to our biblical understanding of a supreme being. Okay? So it's appropriate to use the term God just to refer to a supreme being. And God isn't necessarily tied just to the Christian understanding of God. For example, the term God isn't even found in the Bible. What do I mean by that? Well, as you know, the Bible wasn't written in English. The Bible was written in Hebrew and Greek, and those two languages didn't even know about the term God. Okay? So when we translate the Bible from Hebrew or Greek to English, we insert and translate the terms that they were using for a supreme being to English, God. So, because that's our word in the English language for a supreme being. So where in the world did this word come from? Well, a little background to the word God. It comes from this Proto-Germanic language, Gudan. So if you go back far enough in our English and German are closely connected in terms of language groups. Gudan goes back to this ancient North European language, and it was the term that they used for a supreme being. And as languages develop, human languages are fluid, they're constantly changing, right? And so as languages developed, this term, Gudan, became used differently in different parts of the world, different languages. So Gudan developed into the term Odin in Norse mythology. You're familiar with Thor and Odin, right? That's where the term Odin comes from. Ultimately, the root, Gudan, in Norse mythology. In German, this word Gudan developed ultimately into Gott. So when I used to teach in Germany, this was the word that they would use to refer to a supreme being. And then in modern English, ultimately this term developed into God in modern English. So that's where the word God comes from. And I find this explanation to be helpful for folks sometimes. And sometimes I do it at the very beginning so that folks understand when I'm making a case for a supreme being, I'm using the term God because that's the word in our language, at least, that we often use to refer to this idea of there being an ultimate supreme being. What we've done so far in the class is look at reasons and evidence to believe that there is a God, right? And all theists believe that there is a God. Atheists say that there is no God. So theists are those of us who think that there is a God. So if we've done our job well and made a good case for theism, then we can reject atheism, and we can reject another belief system we haven't talked much about yet, and that is pantheism, or another version of it is panentheism. But basically, to summarize, pantheism is the idea that the universe just is God. But I think if we've done our job well making a case for theism, we also can reject any sort of pantheistic belief systems because, again, the universe had a beginning. The universe can't be the ultimate being. We've discussed that from a scientific perspective. The universe can't be what's ultimate. The universe can't be the uncaused cause because it had a beginning, so it needed a cause. So I think we can reject pantheism as well. So if we've made a case for theism, we've made a case that there is a God, but we can't stop here. We can't stop here just with theism. Because among all of us theists, Christians, Muslims, Aristotle, other thinkers, Hindus who believe that there's a supreme being, because within and among us theists, there is disagreement about what God is like. So even though, for example, a Muslim and ourselves would agree that there is a supreme being, we are going to disagree about what God is like. Yes, there's going to be some agreement on the basic attributes. As we've listed out those basic attributes, a lot of theists are going to agree to those, but there are going to be other characteristics, other attributes of God that the different theistic groups disagree about. So in a sense, think about us moving from that conversation to now this new one, where before the conversation was more between atheists and theists. Is there a God? Is there not a God? We've rejected atheism because we've made a good case for God. But now among us theists, get all of us theists in a room, now the conversation among us who believe that there's a God, it's going to be whose description of God is most accurate, whose description of God is correct. And that's where we're taking the conversation from this point. Now, sometimes the question is worded like this. You might have heard the question worded this way before. Do Christians and Muslims believe in the same God? Now, I think that question is poorly worded, and here's why. If theism is true, there is only one God, right? I mean, that's the whole point of theism, that there is one ultimate supreme being. So it's kind of like I use the example sometimes to make my point here of two different cultures who believe different things about the sun, the star in our solar system, right? So think about two cultures, two belief systems about the sun. Maybe a more primitive culture and a more, I don't know, you want to call modern scientific culture, right? They have different beliefs about the sun. The ancient, more primitive culture might believe about the sun that it's a monster and it's in battle with the moon and they're chasing each other every day, right? Around, primitive cultures have believed things like that. Whereas we, in more of a scientific culture, would believe different things about the sun, that it's a mass of incandescent gas, as the song goes. So you could ask the same question of these two different belief systems, these two different cultures, about their beliefs of the sun. Do they believe in the same sun? Well, in a sense, yes. I mean, there's only one sun, right? They believe in the same sun. So I think the question is poorly worded. A better way to ask the question is, whose description of the sun is correct? Whose description, whose idea of the sun is more accurate? So you could say, whose description of God is correct? Is Aristotle's description of God correct? Is the Muslim's description of God correct? Or is the Christian's description of God correct? I think that's the better way to ask the question and then, in turn, answer the question. So we're stuck with this dilemma, if you will. How do we know whose description of God is correct? Now, among all theists, there's general agreement over some of the basic attributes of God, but when we get down into more of the nitty-gritty, more of the fine-tuned details, if you will, about describing God, there are certainly big differences. So how do we know? How do we know whose description of God is correct? Boy, it sure would be nice if God himself would communicate with us and tell us exactly what he's like. Wouldn't that be nice? If we had some sort of communication from God, if we had some sort of, let's say, I don't know, message from God telling us what he's like, then we would know whose description of God is more accurate. And of course, that's what we believe, right? Most all theists are going to believe that God has communicated to them given them some sort of message describing in more detail what God is like. The problem is, pretty much all different theistic groups claim to have messages from God. We Christians claim we have messages from God, the Bible. Other theistic groups think the same thing, the Quran, Muslims, the Book of Mormon. And all of these different messages, Hindus, would have different books or messages they think are from God. And it can't be the case that all these messages really are from God because they describe God quite differently. So there can't be contradictions, right, about what God is like. So it can't be that all these messages are from God. And so how do we know what really is a message from God and what's not? There's a lot of fakes out there. There's a lot of things that claim to be from God, but aren't. And there's also a lot of mistakes as well, honest mistakes you could call them, that people think they have a message from God, but they really don't. So since there's so many fakes and mistakes out there, how do we know what really is a message from God and what isn't? And that's where we're going with this class. That is the second step in how I present a case for Christianity. How do we know that Jesus' message in particular really is from God? So we're going to spend the next few weeks, and I'll be making that case that Jesus' message, his description of God, is accurate, and give reasons why we can confidently believe that Jesus' message is from God. And then the last step, of course, is making the case that the entire Bible is from God as well. But there's a reason why I take this first step, this second step, before the third one. And I'll try to explain that as we go through it. Well, the last thing I'd like to do, see, we're getting close to 10 o'clock here, so we might have some time for Q&A this morning. So be thinking, maybe write down some questions that you've had over the last few weeks. Write down a question, even if it doesn't pertain to today's content. Feel free to ask the question. But before we get to Q&A, I want to look more closely at Acts 17. Because I think there's a sense in which this approach that we're taking is following Paul's example there in Acts 17. I think we're following Paul's example in doing things similarly to how he did them when he made a case for Christianity. So turn in your Bibles to Acts 17. I'll put it up on the PowerPoint as well. But I want to look in a little bit more detail. The last lecture that we're going to do in this class is about, let me just say the title. The title of the last lecture that we'll do towards the end of this semester, the last lecture of this class is titled, Is Apologetics Biblical? So one concern sometimes that Christians have is this path that we're taking to make a case for Christianity. Is that a biblical approach to do this? What we're doing in this class, making a case for Christianity the way that we're doing it. Is that a biblical approach? I used to do that at the beginning of the class, but it seemed a little bit odd that we would do that before we would even make a case for Christianity. So it's more like we're making a case for Christianity, and then we've made a case that the Bible really is from God. We will look at the Bible and see if the path that we took was appropriate, was a biblical approach. And then I'll be making the case, of course, that it is a biblical approach, this apologetic method that we're doing in this order. But maybe a little preview of that we can see here this morning in Acts 17. And the reason I do this now is because of this conversation and how pertinent it is to talking about other theistic belief systems and the similarities that we share in our beliefs about a supreme being. So we see Paul in this context in Athens talking to Greek philosophers. And he tells them that they have some things right. They have some things right. They believe correctly that there is a supreme being, and even quotes some of their authors, these Greek poets, to make his case that, hey, you guys believe these things about God, and you're right. This is what your Greek poets say. This is what your Greek thinkers say about God. And that's correct. You guys are correct in that. You believe correctly that there is a supreme being. But, as we'll see here in Acts 17, Paul does explain that some of their beliefs about what this supreme being is like are incorrect. And he gently points out their incorrect beliefs. And then closes by giving them evidence to believe that Jesus' message really is from God. In other words, Jesus' description, Jesus' message of God is more accurate, is the correct understanding of God. So let's just read Acts 17, and then maybe we can talk through a little bit of it. So here's Acts 17, and I'm just going to read the verses that are on the board here. So this is Paul talking, and he says, the God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands. That was part of their incorrect thinking of God, right? Nor is he served with human hands. That's another thing that they were wrong about. As though he needed anything from us, since he himself gives to all people life and breath and all things. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation, that they would seek God, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and exist. That's a quote. It's not as obvious here in the text, but it's clearly, and historians and commentators have noted this for centuries. He's quoting a Greek poet there, and we know the poet by name, as I said on the previous slide. And even as some of your own poets have said, this is one's more obvious quote, we also are his children. Being then, you guys are correct, that we are the children of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and thought of man. So in a sense, you guys are correct that there is a supreme being, but there's another sense in which your description of him, you're off in a few ways, and he's pointing that out. Therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance, God is now declaring, giving a message, communicating to men that all people everywhere should repent, because he has fixed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness through a man whom he has appointed. So now he's getting to this idea that God has communicated to us. He's given us a message. He's spoken. He's described himself. Doesn't go into a lot of detail here, but he talks about God's, in a sense, holiness, God's judgment, right? That we are in a predicament because we have done bad things, all of us, and God is going to judge us, and we need to get right with God, basically. And then why should we believe this? Why should we believe that this declaration or this message from God really is, in fact, from him? Well, it's because God has furnished proof to all men by raising Jesus from the dead. And so Paul points to the resurrection in particular as good evidence, good reason to believe that this declaration, this message, really is from God. And that's going to be our main strategy. So I guess maybe a little preview, foreshadowing of where we're going, is we're going to be spending a lot of time looking at Jesus' miracles, and in particular his resurrection, as good reasons and evidence to believe that his message really is from God. Because we would, I think, reasonably conclude that only God can do miracles or give somebody the ability to do miracles. And so that miracle test, if you will, I think is the strongest argument for Jesus' message really being from God, Jesus' miracles and resurrection. Okay, go ahead and raise your hand if you have questions, and I'm going to grab my phone real quick and see how much time we have for Q&A. Got a good decent 10 minutes. We'll get through a few questions depending on how long-winded I am. Yes, sir.
Have you ever heard of that program, Alien Ancestors, that's always on TV trying to prove Earth was seeded by some aliens, or our technologies were given to us from an alien culture no longer here. They left their footprint. And what do you think about that as an argument? It seems like it is a substitute for even going further. I mean, there's so much evidences that they raise that would lead us to a God creator, but they are in fact saying these evidence lead to an alien ancestor that colonized or enlightened the world with his technologies, kind of thing.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I'm not familiar with the program, but I am definitely familiar with the ideas. You know, those pop up quite a lot. Sometimes they pop up in kind of kooky ways, and we can just kind of brush them off as tabloids and stuff. But then there's other people who I think, you know, take it more seriously. This idea that there might be intelligent life out there, but the connections that you're making, I think, really are interesting. That they look, especially back at ancient civilizations, and maybe even our own DNA or the life on Earth, and are coming to some of the same conclusions. That it seems like there's a design here. It seems like, as we've noted before, the only way we've ever seen design come about is through intelligent minds, and so they're positing intelligent minds behind the design. It would just be a different type of mind. It would be a mind from another planet, let's say, as opposed to a supernatural being. But I think the same thing would happen, and you see this happen in the news quite often, where people think they see some sort of design on Mars, right? The rover or whatever comes across something that might be a structure or a statue or something built into the sand. Is it appropriate to call it sand on Mars? I'm not sure. But they see something on Mars which looks designed, and everybody gets excited for a few minutes. But that goes to the design argument, right? Because we would never go to Mars and, you know, find a skyscraper and say, well, that just came about accidentally, right? That just happened. No, we immediately recognize that that's specified complexity, a skyscraper or a statue or whatever we would find on Mars. We would conclude, rightly so, that there must have been some sort of alien civilization on Mars, right? And so it's that same sort of detecting design and rightly concluding that design must have come from some sort of an intelligent mind. And we're making the exact same sort of claims, but just making them about the first cause behind the universe. So similar connections. That's good. Yes, sir.
Isn't that interesting that you're watching a TV show or movie, and instead of mentioning God, does it the universe?
Yes, that's happening more and more. You're exactly right. It drives me crazy. Yeah, so what he has noted is that more and more, and you see this among celebrities, I hear The Rock doing this often for whatever reason, I don't know why, but celebrities and in TV shows and movies, they'll often talk about the universe as though the universe is God. They'll say, man, I'm so thankful to the universe that I have this situation in life, or they'll just almost use the term universe as we used to use the term God before. And it makes me wonder, you know, if there's maybe some Eastern influence here, some pantheism going on, the idea that God and the universe are one in the same, right? I think that might be going on here as well. But also, you know, within a atheistic belief system, it's almost as though people can't help to be thankful to something, right? It's almost that they can't help. It's almost like it's built into us, this idea that there's some sort of higher power, let's say, right? And so if people have come to the conclusion that there is no God, they might have nowhere else to go but then just the universe itself. And so the universe, the term, the universe, has now become kind of used in a lot of conversations in ways that we used to use the word God for. So yeah, I've noted that as well. It is interesting. All right, any other questions this morning?
You mentioned that we're going to talk about the miracles that Jesus did.
Yes.
What do we do with the miracles that Satan can do?
Yeah, good question.
It tells us that he can even appear as an angel of light.
Yeah. Yep, that's always one of the first questions that come up, especially among Christians, when we talk about the miracle test as to how we know a message really is from God. Well, what about Satan? Can't he do miracles or supernatural things? And we'll talk a little bit about that in this class. I do have an 1.5 hour long lecture on the Convincing Proof YouTube channel where I tackled that subject alone. So it's an 1.5 hour lecture just answering that question. Can Satan do miracles? And conclusion is no. I would say that Satan cannot do miracles, and that would safeguard then us being duped, if you will, through using the miracle test and being duped by Satan's by any sort of things that Satan could do. So in that lecture then, I go through all the verses. A lot of them are in Revelation and Thessalonians, talking about Satan doing things at the end of the world, at the end times, and how to best interpret those. And I think it's best to interpret those as Satan not being able to do miraculous things, but doing things that appear miraculous. So in other words, in Thessalonians, what Satan is doing in the end times is referred to as false signs, false wonders, false miracles. And so I take that to mean part of my argument in this 1.5 hour lecture is that's one reason to think that Satan cannot do miracles, because it's described there what he's doing is false. So it's similar to me, it would be similar to, you could say, an illusionist. An illusionist, if they're good, might be able to trick us. Or even thinking about Pharaoh's magicians, right? Going back to Exodus. That we can be tricked into thinking something miraculous or supernatural has taken place when in fact it hasn't. But 1.5 hours more details to go through in that thought process. But no, that's a good question. That's always the first question that comes up when we talk about this miracle test. Okay, got just a couple more minutes. We could probably do one more question as long as it's quick. Yes, sir.
Knowing that the number of people who do not believe in God is growing, have you found in your times of just evangelism on campuses or wherever you're going that first cause, design, or moral arguments tend to be the ones that help those 1 out of 4 now see that they may have a different way to think in the future?
Yeah. No, I think it is helpful. It's always a good conversation, at least. I mean, it's not very often, as many hundreds and hundreds of times I've shared the gospel. It's only happened maybe 15 or 20 times where somebody's, accepted Christ right there on the spot. So a lot of times you just don't know the impact that your conversation might have down the road in their lives or their thinking. But no, I think it always leads to a good conversation. I've found that those who don't believe in God have not often been exposed to some of these good arguments for the existence of God. They've mostly encountered maybe friends or family who have just made it sound like they're dumb because they don't believe in God, or it's just such an obvious thing, why don't you believe it? And they've never been exposed to really good reasons and evidence for it. It's just been something maybe that's been pushed on them that they should just do it, they should just believe. And so if, at a minimum, I've found that it usually will at least spark their interest to hear of advanced, sophisticated arguments.
But is one of those three more compelling than the others that you found in your conversations?
Yeah, no, good question. I think I've told you before that I find the first cause and the design arguments more compelling than the moral argument, even though the moral argument is the one that I specialize in terms of my work and research and writing. But it varies on the individual. A lot of people, I think, might intuitively grasp the moral argument more quickly because morality is just such a thing that we deal with on a daily basis, right? Right and wrong, good and evil. They're upset often about evil in the world, something that they don't like is going on in their own life or in society in general. And so it's a very easier starting point to talk about right and wrong, good and evil, than it is more of an abstract concept like the beginning of the universe or the fine-tuning constants of the universe. Some of those are kind of abstract, and it depends on the personality, their background. You know, if I'm talking to an engineer or somebody who's more scientific oriented, they are going to maybe lean more towards those technical arguments. But the moral argument is something that everybody, because we have, again, I believe from Romans 2, such a strong intuition of good and evil, I think that's an easier starting point for a lot of people. Yeah. All right, thanks so much for coming to this class, and next week we'll pick up with Jesus' miracles.